The stagecoach rattled into Dry Creek under a pale winter sun, its wheels stirring up the thin dust that clung to the air like a memory that didn't know how to leave. The driver cracked the reins once. The horses slowed, and the sound of their hooves softened against the packed earth of Main Street. A few townsfolk paused to watch, not because new arrivals were rare, but because they were never just arrivals. Every stranger carried the weight of a story no one had asked for yet. From the last step down, she lingered, a woman in a washed-out blue dress that hung loose on her frame, her eyes fixed on the ground as if the planks of the boardwalk held answers she could not bear to search for in the faces around her. The wind toyed with a few loose strands of her hair. She clutched a scuffed leather case, the kind that could barely hold a life's worth of possessions, if that life had been stripped to almost nothing. At the end of the street, Elias Crow was tying down a sack of feed to the back of his wagon. He was a man shaped by the land, the slow set of his shoulders, the lines around his eyes not just in the sun, but from the long years it marked. He noticed the exchange happening outside the boarding house. Hattie Lane shaking her head at the woman, one hand braced on the doorframe, the other making a small, firm gesture that meant no. "She can't pay the week," muttered Virgil Pike from the store porch, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. His voice carried far enough for Elias to hear. "If you ask me, better she keeps moving. That kind of trouble's never worth the cost." The woman's head stayed bowed. She adjusted her grip on the case, like she was bracing to carry it farther than her strength could take her. Elias didn't move at first. He'd learned over the years that stepping into someone else's trouble could be like catching a thorn in your palm, a small thing that festered deep. But he'd also learned that some things you did without thinking too hard, or you'd never do them at all. When he walked toward her, the boards creaked under his boots. "You cook?" His voice was low, the question neither warm nor sharp. She blinked up at him for the first time, eyes a washed brown that seemed to weigh the worth of answering. "Yes, sir." Her voice was hushed, shaped by a throat that didn't speak much. "I need someone to keep a kitchen on my place. Not fancy work, just steady." He glanced toward her thin hands, red from cold. "Room and meals. Pay at the end of the month." Her gaze shifted toward the street beyond him, as if measuring the space between where she stood and where she might run. Then she gave the smallest nod. The ride out was quiet, the wagon wheels crunching over frost-hardened earth. The land opened wide around them, low hills scattered with juniper, the sky holding a color that could not decide between blue and gray. She sat with her case on her lap, fingers laced tight around its handle. He said little. She said less. By the time the ranch came into view, the sun had thinned to a pale coin over the horizon. On the porch, a boy no more than 10 leaned against a post, a pocket knife glinting in his hands as he shaved a curl from a stick. His eyes fixed on the woman with the same guarded look Elias had once seen in a half-wild colt. "This is Marin," Elias said. "The introduction bears a fence post. She'll be cooking for a while." The boy didn't answer, only slipped the knife into his pocket and disappeared inside. Her room was small, just off the kitchen. A narrow bed, a washstand, a single quilt folded at the foot. The air still carried the faint scent of cedar from the stove. She set her case on the bed, but didn't open it. Through the wall, she could hear the low murmur of voices, Elias's steady tone, the boy's quick replies. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the shape of them. A life already built, already running without her. She laid down without undressing, staring at the dark knot in the ceiling boards. The wind pressed against the window, whispering like it meant to find its way inside. She thought about the last bed she'd slept in, the last door that had closed behind her. She didn't believe in safe places anymore, only in pauses before the next push back into the cold. But still, for now, she was inside. For now, the door had stayed shut against the night. If you want, I can continue straight into Section 2 in the same cinematic style, so the slow burn emotional growth begins seamlessly. Would you like me to? Morning frost laced a corral fence in delicate white threads, the kind that would vanish as soon as the sun climbed high enough. Marin stood at the pump. Sleeves rolled to her elbows, water spilling over her raw, red hands. Without thinking, she hummed, a low, shapeless tune, just keep the cold from creeping too deep into her bones. She didn't notice Finn in the doorway until the sound faltered and died. He lingered there a moment longer, eyes quick, before vanishing into the house. Days in the Crow Ranch kitchen found their own rhythm. Marin rose before the light, kneading bread in the half-dark while the fire came to life in the stove. She learned the way Elias liked his coffee, strong enough to taste of iron, and the way Finn would only eat eggs if the yolk stayed whole. She spoke little, but her hands worked steady, setting aside a biscuit for the boy before Elias came in, sliding it onto a tin plate, like it wasn't meant to be noticed. Elias noticed. He also noticed the mended cuff of his work shirt one evening, the stitching finer than anything he could have done himself. He didn't mention it, just wore the shirt the next day without comment. When they went into town for supplies, Virgil Pike's eyes followed them from the store counter. "Guess you found yourself a helper," he drawled to Elias. "Or something else." The words hung in the air, carrying the sour edge of gossip. Marin kept her face still, her gaze on the jars of preserves stacked by the window. Elias didn't answer right away. Then, without looking at Virgil, he rested his hand lightly on Marin's shoulder. Not a claim, not quite, but enough to make Pike glance away. Back at the ranch, the kitchen began to smell different. Not just of beans and bread, but of thyme, of onions softened slow in the pan, of something that spoke of care rather than bare necessity. Finn lingered near the doorway now, watching her roll dough, sometimes passing her the tin of salt without being asked. One evening, he shuffled in holding a small block of wood, whittled into the rough shape of a bird. "It's a hawk," he said, almost challenging her to disagree. "It's fine work," she said, turning it over in her hand as though it were made of something precious. "Hawks see farther than anyone else. That's a good thing to be." His ears turned pink, and he mumbled something before slipping back outside. The days passed like this, not with grand gestures, but with silences that felt less empty. A rainstorm came sudden and hard one afternoon, rattling the windows and pinning them indoors. Elias pulled a deck of cards from the cupboard, and they sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, the only sound to the steady tap of cards on wood, the patter of rain on the roof. No one seemed in a hurry for the game to end. At night, when she lay in the small room off the kitchen, Marin thought less about leaving. The wind still pressed against the windows, but it no longer sounded like it was calling her out. It sounded more like it was guarding something inside. "Do you want me to move directly into Section 3 now, so the emotional climax lands while this slow warmth is fresh?" A hard wind carried the smell of snow, sharp and clean, like it had swept down from some lonely ridge and hadn't touched another living thing on its way. The sky hung low and heavy, the kind of gray that made the land seem endless. Marin was out by the line, hanging the last of the wash, her fingers stiff from the cold, when she saw the rider crest a far hill. He came slow, not because the horse was tired, but because the man wanted to be seen coming. As he drew nearer, she knew him, the lean, sharp-eyed face, the way he sat his saddle like he owned the ground he crossed. He swung down and let the reins drop. His eyes skimmed over the ranch house before fixing on her. "Time to come with me," he said, like it was already decided. "You were promised. Still are." The words landed heavy, though her heart didn't race the way it used to. Before she could answer, the door opened and Finn stepped onto the porch, freezing at the sight of the stranger. His small frame went taut, his hand curling into a fist at his side. Elias followed, his stride unhurried, but there was something that set his jaw that hadn't been there before. He came to stand between her and the man, his shadow falling across her boots. "She's with us," Elias said, his voice low, even, no raised tone, no threat, but the words carried like a weight you couldn't set down. The rider's gaze shifted, testing, measuring. "You sure you want this trouble?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence was an answer of its own. Marin could have stepped back, could have slipped away from this moment and kept running, the way she always had. Instead, she moved closer, close enough for her hand to find Finn's shoulder. The boy didn't flinch. The man spat in the dirt, muttered something bitter, and turned back to his horse. His departure was swallowed by the wind, leaving only the smell of snow behind. Inside, the kitchen felt warmer than it should have, given the weak fire. Marin set the table with 3 plates, ladling stew into Elias's bowl before her own. She piled Finn's high without comment. They ate mostly in silence, save for the scrape of spoons and the occasional clink of tin against tin. Halfway through the meal, Finn reached for the bread. "Pass it, Ma." The word caught, hanging in the air, his cheeks flushing as he corrected himself. "Marin." Elias didn't look at her right away. When he did, it was brief, enough for her to see the flicker of something in his eyes that wasn't surprise. She didn't correct the boy either. After the dishes were washed and set to dry, Elias lingered in the doorway. She was wiping the counter, sleeves pushed to her elbows, hair slipping loose from its pins. She looked up and met his gaze. This time, she didn't look away. It wasn't a declaration, wasn't even a smile, just a quiet, certain knowing that they had stopped being three separate lives sharing a roof. Somewhere between biscuits saved, shirts mended, and a man stand at the edge of the yard, they had become something harder to break. And out here, where the wind could strip you to bone, and the land gave nothing it didn't take twice over, that was as close to a promise as a person could ask for.